Can we start just by talking about your report as a whole? It's called Nine Circles of Hell, Places of Detention in Ukraine Under the Russian Occupation, March 2022 to December 2022. Could you summarise what you found for us? What do you think are the most important takeaways?
Well, perhaps it's important to start by saying that this work has been a collaborative endeavour, and we have relied very much on our partners on the ground in Ukraine. So Ukraine Without Torture, Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group, and Protection of Prisoners of Ukraine, 3 NGOs, and then also a European NGO called the European Prison Litigation Network. It's crucial, this report, because it comes out with what we consider to be evidence of what kind of violations are taking place in Ukrainian places of detention under Russian occupation. So here we're talking about places which normally are not accessible to human rights organizations or anyone else. So in that sense, that access is quite extraordinary. And we have collated 700 cases of human rights violations, including 152 cases of what we believe to be torture or other forms of inhuman treatment. These are the key findings. And let me also say, I think one of the major takeaways from this report is that we see the torture being widespread and systematic in the occupied territories under Russian control, which means that actually this might be something that amounts to crimes against humanity, which is a very serious affair, obviously.
Thank you, Therese. Vadim, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, maybe about chronology of this report, how it started, because exactly it started from February, right after the full-scale invasion. Just a reminder that the war in Ukraine started not in 22, but it started in 2014, so we call it full-scale invasion 22. And when it started, we saw a massive scale of atrocities, and there were a lot of initiatives to document war crimes committed by Russians in Ukraine. We thought that we as organizations who work on prisons specifically should work on our thematic area of expertise, and we started to monitor prisons together with our partners on the ground. In the beginning, it was very difficult because no access. Obviously, nobody had access to these prisons. So we decided to do open source documentation and focus on the information of all kinds coming from social media, websites on what was happening in prisons. But also we had insiders in prisons. And there was a difficult balance for us whether we could actually talk to them about what was happening there, because we know that it is very easy to wiretape any conversation, and prison administrations, they do it. And so the Russians would obviously do it, and we thought that we wouldn't risk, and we would rather have no information about what was happening than put at risk any prisoner, because a word about torture could cost someone a life in that prison. So we focused very much on open source, and then we started to develop a strategy. How do we document? And we thought that, well, maybe let's talk to prisoners who got released and who actually returned to the Ukraine's controlled territories, or who got to Russia and then were released in Russia and then returned to Ukraine, and they could speak freely without fear of reprisals. And we managed to collect a lot, and we started to see right away that basically everyone to whom we spoke about torture not only applied in prison in general, but applied to them. So that was a systematic pattern right away that we saw from all, and there were different prisons in these regions, and everybody spoke about torture. So we thought that torture should be our thematic focus. And then when Kherson was liberated in November by the Ukrainian armed forces, a prison was liberated as well. And in that prison, there were prisoners from many different prisons which were under the Russian occupation, meaning that we basically had right away access to prisoners from various prisons who experienced Russia's occupation. And we had access as organizations who have specific mandate to visit Ukrainian prisons. So we had different avenues, and something we didn't expect in the beginning. First, we thought, okay, it's only open source, we have very limited information. And then we had an explosion of information, a lot of testimonies, and that's why this report.
In your report, you talk about a lot of different sorts of institutions. Some are prisons, official places of detention, police stations, unofficial places of detention as well. Could you just talk us through and help our listeners understand sort of where these places are? What do they look like?
Right. So the priority for us was were prisons, because this was something we worked on. But also we thought, right, the places of detention are not only prisons. These are police stations, these are social institutions like psychiatric hospitals. These are also unofficial places of detention, which could be garages, basements of individual houses. So we thought that maybe focusing only on prisons is not enough, especially if that there is a lot of information on other types of places of detention. And we thought that compiling it in one report to give a reader a proper overview of all places of detention and to compare patterns there, that was something we could do and we should do. Now we see that our focus is shifting a bit towards prisons, more towards prisons maybe because we have a lot of direct victims to whom we can talk, while with other places of detention it's not always the case. And also there are other organizations who work on specific places of detention. This report focused heavily on prisons.
Yeah, I think the important thing here is both the official and the unofficial angle, because normally one would expect that persons are held in a lawful manner and that there is no arbitrary detention, which of course might be the case in those places where it's official, but certainly all of these unofficial places of detention are places where we don't only see the human rights violations in terms of torture and ill treatment, but also to begin with the fact that they are arbitrarily detained and held in places which are unacknowledged, which means these are secret places of detention, which means that legally speaking, these persons are actually also victims of enforced disappearance. So here there is another layer of human rights violations because of the mere fact that they're held in unacknowledged and unofficial places of detention.
Thanks, Vadim and Therese. Can we go back then to last year and can you both of you talk to me a little bit about what happened in those first few months when the Russian troops did advance hundreds of miles across Ukraine and took over lots of state institutions? What did that look like? What were the first things the occupying forces did? How does this story start for you?
So I think Russians, they had a very clear strategy to control civilian population by places of detention. So places of detention was an instrument for them to control civilian population. That's why one of the first administrative acts was to establish police stations, or just use the previous police stations to establish detention cells for those who would be a slightest threat to their regime, which would be former police officers, former Ukrainian soldiers who were not engaged in the army at that point when they occupied. Also civilians, ordinary civilians like teachers who wouldn't collaborate with them or who would prepare any counter-propaganda or could have any influence or undermine the occupation regime. So, and it reminds me of a saying, I'm not sure exactly who said that, but the one who has keys from a prison has keys from a town or from a city. And that's what was happening. The first thing was to actually get into police stations, to get keys from these detention cells. Prisons came later. So then for 2 months, prisons stayed without any attempts from Russians to occupy them. And then they actually started to change administrations in prisons as well. So these were a bit different time frames, but the first thing was police stations. And like social institutions, they would be the latest. And there would be very little intervention in social institutions. And wherever there was intervention by the Russians, they started with torture. So torture was a clear instrument to control the civilian population, to spread intimidation, to retaliate against any efforts to support the Ukrainian army on the side of the civilian population, or to boycott the Russian occupation. And Ukrainians were very much opposing the Russians, and they even post in a Facebook page or in other social media could lead to detention and torture.
Can we talk a little bit about the experience of Ukrainian prisons in the occupied territories? It's not something I think that I've ever seen much work done on in the last year, so it's very interesting to read your report and read the experience of the people who were held there and then during the occupation were essentially abused and suffered torture by the Russian occupiers. Can you talk, both of you, just about what that experience for Ukrainian prisoners was like? Can we tell their stories?
Well, the report is very much based indeed on individual stories. And I think the best way to describe what was happening are the words of people and direct speech of people. That's why we have so much of direct speech there. It reminds me of one prisoner saying that, well, when the Russians came, torture became a norm. It became a norm, and prisoners were beaten from the very first day. For example, in Kherson pretrial detention center, when Russians entered the prison, I think it was in May, they started by launching grenades to live in quarters of prison of this prison, to intimidate right away, to show that here are the new administrators who came and we will manage you, don't oppose, don't resist, and you are now under our control. And then they started to look for prisoner leaders, any prisoners who had links, who held a patriotic position, a pro-Ukrainian attitude, or who was, for example, Ukrainian speaker as well. So they targeted those who could be any threat to them. And of course, former Ukrainian soldiers who were ordinary prisoners, there were such prisoners as well. It was much worse for them, of course. They were even taken away from these prisons, and we don't know what happened to them after. So from the very first day, and then they started to do searches in prisoners' cells. They would beat prisoners every time. They killed prisoners as well to show what would happen to those who pose any problem to the Russians. So there were many attempts to spread this atmosphere of fear that prisoners behave very calmly, do not oppose anyhow. Concerning the civilian population, it was also a different pattern in a way. So while in prisons they need to keep an order and to maintain security, while in the outside prisons, let's say, this official place of detention, like police stations, they were used to suppress any opposition to their rule. Patriots, those who are known for patriotic position, those who would be suspects of transmitting coordinates of the Russian troops to the Ukrainian army. And even children were detained in unofficial places of detention. So we have such a case, for example, I think a 15-year-old was detained in basement in the appeal court because he had some patriotic images in his cell phone or something like that. So they targeted clearly pro-Ukrainians or those who would anyhow resist Russians. And Teresa, please feel free to join.
Yeah, I think maybe what is worth also underlining is the fact that the kinds of torture that we saw were very different. So we saw physical torture, we saw psychological torture, we saw sexual torture. So just to give you an example, physical torture would be what we often see in prisons, but here much worse. We see punches, we see kicks, but also being hit with truncheons. We saw people being exposed to what is called like near suffocation, where you place a plastic bag over their head, and only the moment that they can almost not breathe anymore, you remove it. The front page of the report, which is a gas mask, you can see here, that was also used with the Z on, which is the sign for Russia's war against Ukraine. So the prisoners had these masks put on them, and then the actual input of oxygen was closed down so that again it would have the effect of almost suffocating them, and only once they either had fainted or near fainting, they would be removed again and get air. So that's the physical part. Often we saw the physical torture being combined with psychological torture. And this, for instance, would be threats of execution. So again, a person would be hooded, and then the officials of the prison would start shooting, but just above their head. So you cannot see anything. You don't know whether they just missed you this time around and whether next time they'll hit you in the head. And this is known to be one of the extreme, brutal and very, very traumatizing types of torture, of course. So these mock executions took place, and prisoners were also threatened that if they did not do, as the Russian would say, then their family members might also be exposed to mock executions or beatings. And then finally, let me mention the sexual torture, because this is something which is very severe as well. We saw a number of cases in which people had electrodes placed to their genitals, and then they would simply open up the current, the electricity, and then they would have these, electricity going to their genitals, something which is not only extremely painful, but you can imagine also the psychological effects of this, and also the effects in terms of a man, for instance, or a woman, having administered current through your genitals, what that means for reproduction possibilities. So an extremely brutal and an extremely cruel pattern of these three types of torture.
The title of your report, we mentioned it at the beginning of this recording, 9 Circles of Hell. Can you tell us where this quote comes from and why you chose it?
That's a story about a prisoner in a prison. It's called Pivnichna Colony or Pivnichna Prison number 90 in Kherson region. There, a prisoner was suspected of cooperating with the Ukrainian armed forces, that he transmitted coordinates of the Russian troops, which he did not admit actually, and then forced him to sign documents when he didn't even see what type of documents. Then they were torturing him by strangling him. For a few days he was tortured. And then he said, well, I cannot bear it anymore, just kill me. And then the torturer, he called his superior, probably in Russia, and it was with a video call. And he asked, so can basically explain the situation, and the superior just nodded, basically cleared this murder. But then the torturer continued to torture the prisoner, and then at some point the prisoner started to faint. They would pour water on him to wake him up, and then he was fainting again. They strangling him, and at some point the torturer said, wait, it's too early. You haven't gone through all 7 circles of hell yet. And these 7 circles, it's a mistake actually, because what was implied would be there's 9 circles of hell. But that was an example of that the prisoner would prefer to die rather than to be subject to that type of torture that long.
You've mentioned in that story the torturers themselves. What do we know about these people? What did you find out in your research?
What we found is that they were very much aware that their names could be spotted. So from the very beginning they came in a uniform which wasn't even a Russian uniform. It was a black uniform. They wouldn't show their faces, but then they started to show faces. Sometimes prisoners heard their nicknames. We have some names. So this report contains also names of perpetrators. And one must also say that among the perpetrators were also Ukrainian prison officers who started to collaborate with the Russians, and they were used as instruments also to torture prisoners. And we also have those names. And these names have been transferred to the Ukrainian and actually international accountability bodies. So in Ukraine there have been already a few prosecutions into this, and we already saw first prison officials arrested, which were collaborants, or they are called collaborants, those who collaborated with Russians. About the Russians is more difficult because they are not on the Ukraine-controlled territories, but their names are sent where they have to be sent, and we will keep that track. We keep receiving more names.
Therese, would you like to add anything to that? What happens next for the? I mean, as Vadim said, in Ukraine, you can maybe find these people, start prosecuting them. What happens for the people who we don't know where they are?
Well, for those that we don't know where they are, it will be very difficult for us, obviously. If we get some information about that, we would be able to track them. But I think from our end, what we have now is already quite a lot of potential evidence for prosecutions, for war crimes, and even crimes against humanity. So we will be sharing this documentation with a number of different institutions. One, of course, is the Prosecutor General's Office, who have already received a number of these cases. Secondly, the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, which is a UN commission that is also investigating these crimes and collecting evidence. And then thirdly, we will also be making submissions to the International Criminal Court, who, as you know, is already investigating both war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I think there's a number of different recipients of this evidence. And finally, I should mention, there's also across Europe 10 different countries that have open investigations into war crimes committed in Ukraine. And those who wish to receive our information, who might have specific needs of names, patterns, that's also some bodies that we will then be able to share the information with.
Thanks, Therese. Thanks, Vadim. Just before we go on, you've spoken in depth about the official places of detention, the prisons that were occupied and the experience of the prisoners. I know you've mentioned it before, but could you sort of sum up and just go through a little bit what the experience for civilians was like in the unofficial places of detention?
Right. Well, first of all, unofficial places of detention, what it is, right? And I mentioned, but maybe to give a few examples, that would be individual, like agricultural compounds next to individual houses or basements of individual houses. That could also be places like official institutions that are not designed for detention. For example, a courts building, and there is a basement, so that basement could be used, and it was used actually in Kherson. Or there would be also sometimes even halls dug into soil a few meters, and people were detained there for a few days. And in one case actually died and scratched their names on the walls of this hall before dying. So this sort of things happened. But what we found that often torture preceded executions. And concerning the unofficial place of detention, another thing worth highlighting maybe is very often these were completely innocent civilian people who were tortured there. And they would be detained for any slightest issue, like a teacher refusing to cooperate, or head of a plant that would refuse to cooperate, or even a priest. So there was a story of a priest who was tortured and in Kharkiv region because they suspected that he cooperated with the Ukrainian intelligence. They couldn't believe that a priest can be not connected to secret services, like it's probably in Russia. And they told exactly that to the priest, that we can't believe that you must have some connections to the intelligence services of Ukraine. And they would use, I think in terms of torture, we saw much more electric torture in unofficial places of detention. Torture used to electrocute people, including through connecting the cables to people's genitalia. And that was, I think it was also used in prisons, but mostly in place of detention. What's interesting is that the Russians had already often portable devices to inflict electric shocks. We even had a story, and this would be devices like military devices, like the military telephones, field telephones, where they would spin a part of it and it would produce electricity. But there was even a case where our former partner who worked for one of our partners, Ukraine Without Torture, who was a monitor of the national preventive mechanism, so a person who would go in peace times who would go to prisons and monitor prisons to check if they were human rights compliant. So he was in Kherson region during occupation, and he was invited by the Russians to their office. And he stayed there for quite a few hours, and they knew everything about him. And they asked him to collaborate with them, to work with the new occupation administration. And he said no, and they said, well, you can go. And when he started to go, they electroshocked him by a taser. He lost consciousness, and when he woke up, he was covered in blood. So they beat him when he was without consciousness. And he then fled to the Ukraine-controlled territories. He's now living abroad. So we had detailed testimonies from him. But it's one of our former colleagues, let's say, from Ukraine Without Torture. Theresa?
I think this sums up very, very accurately who the victims were. They were a multiplicity of different types. So I think, as you mentioned already, perhaps just to mention that in the prisons, what we also saw was that those prisoners that were targeted primarily were those who were convicted of the most serious types of crimes, but also those who are unofficial prisoner leaders, who in many prisons are the ones that sometimes can control other prisoners. So there's a whole hierarchy in prisons amongst the prisoners. And they had this very notable star tattooed on their knees, and that was one of the ways in which the Russians would also identify them and expose them primarily to very brutal forms of ill treatment.
Can we go back and talk a little bit about this idea of this being a systematic strategy, that this isn't random, this is planned? Because this, as your report makes clear, this happens across the occupied territories, places thousands of miles distant from Kherson to Kharkiv. Therese, would you talk a little bit about that when we say it's systematic? What do we mean by that? And what are the implications of that?
Absolutely. So what we did was that there were a number of interviews, in total 121 interviews, of which we did 64 ourselves, our partners. Out of these 64 interviews, 85% alleged torture or inhuman treatment. So this obviously is extremely widespread in terms of the sheer numbers. What is also important to keep in mind is that it was at every single prison facility that we had these stories of torture and inhuman treatment, be it physical, psychological, or sexual. So the ubiquity of the torture in the place of detention, the geographical spread throughout the entire occupied territories, but also the commonalities in terms of the methods that were used, also the commonalities in terms of the victims that were targeted. This all together means that we believe to be able to say that the practice of torture was indeed widespread and systematic. Now, what does that mean? It means in legal terms that this might amount to crimes against humanity. So these would not be, if I may say, quote unquote, mere war crimes, which is of course serious enough in itself, but this is one step up. This is really what we consider to be a crime against humanity, which is one of the most serious international crimes. And this has implications obviously for the ICC or for other courts, either national or future international courts that might be prosecuting these persons, because the conviction will be of a complete different nature. It also means that this might also include persons high up in the system. So we will not only see those that are actually exercising the torture physically, the guards, but we might see also persons held responsible who are, it could be the prison director, but it could also be people much higher up in the system at a political level.
Vadim, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I think it captures very well, maybe about the police stations, I can say, and about the numbers, I think we didn't mention that. So we are speaking about 12 prisons in these newly occupied territories, because there were also a lot of prisons in the Donetsk region and Lugansk region occupied from 2014. So 11 prisons, around 100 police stations, and around 40 social institutions, and it could be even more, and tens of thousands of people altogether. And all police stations, I don't think we heard any case where a police station in an occupied city wouldn't be used to torture civilians. That also shows. And for torture to be systematic, you not necessarily need to have a written plan that torture should take place in all prisons or in all police stations. But by comparing different places of detention, comparing the methods, seeing these people, survivors of torture coming from all prisons, we see that it is systematic and widespread. I think that torture is a norm, captures it in prisoners' words, and that's what we heard from the vast majority, as Teresa mentioned.
We spoke earlier about the experience in the first few months of the full-scale invasion and the occupation and what happened next. Towards the end of last year, we saw a series of successful Ukrainian counteroffensives, the two most famous in the north in Kharkiv and in the south in Kherson. Can you just talk us through what happened there? What did these, because that's where a lot of some of the testimony comes from, what did the advancing troops and the liberated civilians find?
When the Ukrainian armed forces liberated the Kherson region and also a part of Mykolaiv region, that actually all, I think, Mykolaiv region, and there was also a prison there, and in Kherson region, the prisoners were lost a bit. They didn't know what to do. They were closed, and the information came across the prisons that they were mined. So the Russians mined that prisoners couldn't escape, but the prison administration left the prisons. So, and prisoners stayed there, of course, active fighting, and they didn't know what to do. And at some point, they managed to open the doors or the gates of prisons, and they went out. They went to the city, and then the Ukrainian authorities, when they took proper control over, for example, the city of Kherson, they started to deliver a message that prisoners have to return. And it was actually surprising that even live prisoners would return. So they wouldn't escape. Live prisoners who in Ukraine, by the way, do not have a realistic perspective of release. They returned to the Ukrainian controlled prisons, and then they were transferred to other prisons, because in Kherson, for example, it was very dangerous for them to stay there. So they were evacuated to various prisons where we managed to interview them later on. Right, I think that's about prisoners. Of course, there was a lot of confusion among prisoners also in the beginning of occupation, and they were all mentioning that they were waiting for the liberation. So they were, until like the majority of them were very pro-Ukrainian, some implicitly, some explicitly, very few who wanted actually to stay anyhow with Russia. And that was manifested also in prisoners' resistance to participate in this sham referenda that took place, in receiving Russia's citizenship. But some received. So they were forced, and they received Russian citizenship, so they had to deal with that. A lot of problems for them, and many actually were evacuated to the occupied territories and then to Russia. But we can talk about it more. Yeah.
That leads, I think, into my next question. And both of you have talked a little bit about what we don't know. That your report is based on interviews you've done and open source investigations and the work of journalists. But there's an awful lot about the face of some of these people that we don't know. People who were disappeared, as you just said, Vadim, evacuated to Russia or to Luhansk or Donetsk. Can we talk a little bit about that? What you've shone a light on a lot, but there's a lot that still remains in darkness. What is that?
Well, yeah, we can only imagine what's happening now in those occupied territories that remain occupied. And it reminds me a bit March 22, when we were actively trying to find information. There was little information. The majority of information for this report we managed to collect because the region was liberated. And there were, in that specific prison, prisoners from many prisons. They were just concentrated in one. So the majority of information, we got it after the region was liberated, and we learned about all those horrors. That's probably what's happening in the occupied territories. We have some information, but it's not enough. Absolutely, we can only hope that the regions will be liberated as soon as possible, and the Ukraine's counteroffensive is coming according to many sources, and we will see more. We know that some people who managed to escape from the occupation and then like more recent survivors, let's say, they keep speaking the same thing: torture, widespread against civilians, prisoners. We hear, for example, just this morning I double-checked with our partners what's happening with those prisoners who remained like in prisons in Zaporizhia region and in Kherson region in the south of Ukraine. And we have some information, like unconfirmed, unverified, but there is already information that they are building even a prison there. A new one in Henichsk, which is on the occupied areas. They even allegedly returned some prisoners from Russia. Those Ukrainian prisoners who were deported to Russia, they returned them to use their forced labor to build this prison and to build even the new regional prison administration HQ. We can say that torture keeps happening there in places of detention as we speak. And we need to be mindful of that, and think that supports the cause of support to Ukraine, and that these territories need to be liberated as soon as possible. And we will keep monitoring what's happening, and there will be more reports on this. And next reports will have more information, shed more light on what is there. Actually, there is a difficulty for us to evacuate some Ukrainian prisoners who ended up in the Russian territory. So who were transferred to Russia, but then they sometimes do not have passports, they sometimes are detained in migration centers. And we heard that they were tortured on their way to Russia, and in Russia some of them even were forced to go to fight against Ukraine. So we even had that type of information. Yeah, so unfortunately there will be probably another report about much worse cases.
Therese, anything to add to that?
Yeah, perhaps just to mention very briefly that what happens in Russia is something which is very difficult to find out. The only two bodies worldwide who have access to place of detention in Russia is, on the one hand, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and secondly, the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture under the Council of Europe. Because while Russia has been expelled from the Council of Europe, they remain states parties to the convention. So this means that the CPT, which it's called, will be actually conducting a visit to Russia this year, will be moving into place of detention and also prisons. Now, whether they will be able to find some of those prisoners who have been sent from Ukraine, we don't know, because we don't know whether they're held in official place of detention or whether they're actually held somewhere else. So this remains to be seen, but I think this is one of the very few possibilities we actually have to see and verify how they are being treated once they've been transferred to the Russian Federation. Before we end, can I ask you both, obviously this report is made out of hundreds of individual testimonies from people who underwent the worst, most awful kind of treatment imaginable. Are there any that particularly stand out for you that you'd want to share? I mean, as you said, it's their words and their experiences really which we're trying to shine a light on. So for you both, is there anything that really stood out?
It's difficult to speak about, standing there they are all terrible in one way or another, and I think the one that makes the title of this report stands out. But yeah, I think maybe there was, of course, what can be worse than a murder. So we have a very clearly documented case about a prisoner who was killed when the Russians entered Kherson pretrial detention center. So he just didn't fall on the floor in the right time when they screamed that everybody had to face the floor, and they just shoot into him. And then prisoners, his cellmates, had to clean his brains and his skull, and they were actually forced to be on the floor for a few hours after that in blood. So you can just imagine, if I can say this is probably one of the worst. But there were also things like, there was a person who was a former police officer who was tortured and whose wife was pregnant, 9 months. They told him that we will kill you, I think, or something like that, or we will torture you, and then your wife will give birth in bushes as a dog. So psychological torture, which can sometimes be worse than any physical torture. People begging for death because they are tortured to that extent. People killed. It's all a massive atrocity, and I hope this report will tell the world the truth with the words of victims. This is the key, that these words are not lost, and that's why it's so much focused on individual testimonies and on direct speech.
Yeah, I think 9 Circles of Hell, I think that really captures it all, because it's not just about intimidating, it's not just about punishing, it's not just about getting a confession. It's all of these things put together with a lot of brutality, with a lot of sadism. So I think the sheer inhumanity is something which really struck me. So yes, individual cases struck me, but the fact that this is something which seems to be repeated over and over again was something that really, hit me very hard.
Thank you very much, Vadim and Therese. Can I ask you finally, is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important for our listeners to hear?